Hello and welcome. I'm Macrina from Anesi Bindings in South Africa, and in this video I'm going to walk you through the process of rebinding a hard-covered book. For the purpose of this video, we assume that the inside of the book block, is still in reasonable condition. Another time I'll do a video on repairing that. But your cover may well have become battered, or you may want to replace it for another reason. And in this video, I show you two ways of doing that. These are the two books that I'm going to be rebinding. The book blocks are intact, but the covers are somewhat messy. So really, they are just going to be taken apart and given new covers. So to start with, what I do is we want to find the end page, and you will see that the end page is glued to the first page of the book block. And so gently you need to pull it away. With old books, it's usually a fairly easy process. And then I insert a knife in between there and basically slit it open, and then I do the same at the back. If it's very difficult to pull apart on newer books, perhaps you can always cut there, possibly with a Stanley knife. But that's a bit more risky, and there's also a greater chance that you'll cut through the cover, which may not matter, but you can also risk cutting into the book block. But usually with old books, this is sufficient. I now have the two book blocks. On the spine, you can see, and this will vary, that there is a paper band that was glued on here. I can partly tear it off, and the old mull is then underneath it. But I think what I'm going to do is try and work that off with some paste. This one also has one, and I suspect, yes, this also has an old headband. I suspect that this one is going to be more difficult. You can't just pull it off. So what we'll do is I'll show you how to remove excess material from the spine. That can either be done with paste if it works, or else you might have to use heat. Because these were both fairly old books that I suspect were glued with animal glue, I think that the glue will come off using paste, but we'll see in a minute. And so what I do is that if you have a press for this, actually I do have a press, but I'm just going to do this like this. Basically, I'm putting it in here so that we can stand it up and have the spine flat. It doesn't have to be too tight. And what I'm going to do is just take some paste. This is ordinary wheat paste that I have used for something else, but there's a link to how to make it. And I'm basically going to just be careful not to go down onto the side. But the point of doing this is that the paste actually holds the moisture that enables the old glue to dissolve. And one is then hopefully able to scrape it off. Once I have the spine covered in paste, I'm just going to cover it with some plastic to keep the moisture in. and set it aside for perhaps 5 or 10 minutes. And it's time to see whether this is going to come off. It's still quite hard. The paper off, but the mull isn't coming. This is rather a messy job. And it's coming a bit. Okay, so I basically have, after I left it for a bit longer, been able to scrape the old mull off. Be careful, that's what you're not supposed to do. Using a fairly blunt knife, just a kitchen knife. The glue isn't totally dissolving, but this is really enough for this type of thing. So, and this step is not absolutely essential. It really depends on what the spine looks like, and if you want to get it rounder, or if it seems as if there's a whole lot of material on it, this will be fine. I'm not sure what that was. So here we have. Okay, I now have my 2 books that I'm going to recover. This one, the spine got cleaned fairly easily, although the first page has come loose. So I'm going to tip that in, what we call tipping in. And on the second one, it's also slightly loose, so I'll attach that. And I've also decided that I want to keep the end page because it has sentimental value. So I'm just going to tip that in as well and glue it on there. So to tip in the page, all I do is I turn it over and I place a strip of waste paper, put it on top of some waste paper, and then place a strip of waste paper over it so that it leaves a narrow ridge of, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 millimeters, and then with fairly thick glue I basically glue that little ridge. This is the same as what we're going to do for the end pages in a minute. So and here I just line it up so that it's exactly on top of the other pages and press that in there. Oops. Okay. And then with this one, it was just starting to come off. So I'm really, well, I could really just put some on there or some glue on. It's probably best to put it on the actual paper. But not too much, just a little ridge of glue. Make sure that the paper is properly in place. And then press it down. And then I'll do the same for the old end page on this book. I'm then going to measure and cut my end pages. Now for these books I'm just using a cream paper of 120 grams per square meter. And what I usually do with this, it's important for this because we're not going to trim the book. It's important that our end pages are exactly the same size as the pages. So what I normally do is measure, I normally fold them and then measure the one corner, making sure that that's exactly 90 degrees. And then I will place it slightly away from the edge just to get the length. but you can work out your own way of doing this. And I'll mark it off there and there. Be aware also that the book block may not be exactly rectangular, so yeah, you might think you're doing something exact, but it's not exact for the book. So I find it best to measure it on the actual book. I mark it and then I cut it. I also will note that this is the front, because again it's possible for the front and the back to be different, and then I'll basically measure it at the top and the bottom. And then trim that off. And that should be the exact same size as the book. And I then repeat the process for the back. Okay, once I've measured and cut my end pages, I basically do the same as I did with tipping in, which means that I take them, place them outside down. I'll do two together, or at least not outside down, but yes, the outside page down. And in this case, I'm going to place them one on top of each other so that I will have a little ridge of about, no, that's not long enough, about maybe 3 millimeters. And then I put another scrap of paper over there, and I basically glue those little ridges. You could do it one at a time, but this saves time. Make sure that I get them well glued, but you don't want to have too much glue left on there. So I'm take it up, and this one is the back one. Can you see here? Right, and I position it so that it's precisely over the page, and if it fits well, that should go to the edge, and I press that in. Often books like this go up at the edge, so one works it into there. And then I do the same on the other side. Making sure that it's well glued down. You could actually use a bone folder for this. Once the end pages are attached, I put it between either in a press or like this between two planks so that it's upright. It doesn't have to be pressed tightly, but it does just need to be held in place. And I then take a piece of mull, which is a sort of starched gauze. You could also use a thin muslin or something similar. I discuss materials more in the series that I did on case binding. I'll put a link to that. And I'm also using PVA glue, fairly thick PVA glue. And I basically am going to paint PVA glue onto the spine. Be careful at the edges to go outwards like that and not like that. You don't want to glue your pages together. So I go right along the spine, over the original stitching and what remains of the glue. With these books that I'm doing, the stitching is still all intact. You do need to be careful when you are getting rid of the old glue and mull that you don't break the stitching, which is why you only use a blunt knife. But in this case, the stitching is intact. I then also put a little bit of glue on this back of the end pages. It's possible to also do it on the mull, but I find this easier. And I then place the mull down. The mull needs to be just somewhat shorter than the book block, because we're not going to trim it, so we don't want it going over the edges. And then I basically pull it down, not too tight, but so that it's firmly in place. You don't want to have too much glue on the end pages. If that doesn't stick properly, it will again when you case the book in. But make sure it's down, and then I'll go over this again, give it another good layer. This is really pretty much the same as what I did in my series on case binding, except that we didn't stitch the book block, which means that, and there is still some glue, which means that the PVA isn't going to be going into our stitching. Right. And just make sure that it's even. And then I run my fingers along the side to make sure that no glue runs down. And there we have it. And you basically leave that to dry. Okay, our book block is now dried. So it's well intact. But what I'm going to do, and this step is really optional, but I'm now going to sand the edges. It's just good to know about this, because often with older books, the edges can become discolored, and sanding them can give it a new lease of life. To do this, I place my book block between boards in clamps. In this case, I've also put some grey board in between in order to just sort of bridge that gap there. And I usually do this with a machine, to be honest. Also, I usually do it outside, and that's a jolly good idea. I'm only doing it inside for the video because it will be messy. And then I start with a coarser sandpaper, and then I use a finer sandpaper. Okay, and then when you're doing the foredge, it helps to wrap the sandpaper around something round, and you repeat the process. Right, I now have my book. The edges aren't perfect. Sometimes it works better than others, depending on how stained they, or how fast in some of the stains go. On this one it worked better. But it can be a good way of sprucing up a book. Also, the top was had been coloured, and I'd forgotten that it actually takes ages to get off, so it hasn't come off perfectly. What you can do in a situation like this to disguise that is either colour or speckle the edges, which I may do, but I'm not going to show that now. I'll do a separate video on it again. The thing we are going to do now, though, is check if they need to be rounded. This one is somewhat round, but I'll round it a little bit more. And to do that, I just use an ordinary hammer, pull it back and hold it. And I can't do it too hard or my camera will come tumbling down. But go across like that, making sure that what I do on the one side I do on the other until it's as round as I want it. I'm now ready to make the cover. I explain this in greater depth in the video in the series on case binding, which I'll link to. But what I'm going to do, what I need, I have 2 boards cut for the front and the back. Now for this project, which is slightly different than what I did in that video where I made a small notebook, for this one I have made the boards 8 millimeters longer than the height of the book and 3 millimeters narrower. And then the spine board I have cut so that, well, it must be the length of the boards, but I've done it 4 millimeters wider than the width of the spine. So I measured not that one, this one. I measured the spine and then I added 4 millimeters. So I hope that will come right. What I'm going to do now though is the same little jig that I used before, where I actually make a sort of a mock cover, glue it onto a piece of craft paper, and that enables me to check that it's more or less all right. So I'm doing that now, and then I will glue the cover material onto this. Okay, so I now have my cover, which I have made in a sort of mock fashion, and that enables me to check that the book block does fit the cover, or the cover does fit the book block, and it does look as if it's going to be okay. I forgot to say that the gap here, when I glued this together, I left a gap of 7 millimeters. So the boards are 8 millimeters longer than the book and 3 millimeters narrower. The spine board is 4 millimeters wider than the spine, and there's a gap of 7 millimeters. Also, one very important thing to note that both the spine board and this craft paper that I used must have the right grain direction. The boards should also, but this is particularly important. So what I'm going to do now, I'm actually going to do 2 separate ones so you can see a slightly different way of doing it. But with this cover, I'm going to be using this grey paper. It's called Wibalin, which is a very strong paper-based material for covers. And I'm basically just going to smear it in using a old bit of stuff. Here I'm not measuring anything off. I'll show you a different way of doing it in a minute. Okay, so I have now put glue on my paper and pressed the mock cover down, and now I'm and done the corners with the eye. I will show you a different method of doing it in a little while with the other one. And then I basically, and I do also explain this much in greater detail in the series, which I'll link to, but I'm now just pressing this up and using my bone folder to work it up as well. Okay, and then you really, it's really convention, but you do the top and bottom first, and then the sides, pressing it in ever so slightly with your nails, and then bringing that up. And working it so that it's not too jagged. I try and avoid having corners that stick out. because this is paper, you need to be a bit careful, like here. So it's a pretty strong paper, but you still need to be a bit careful. And then I turn it over, work it well. You see here, sometimes the corners are quite sharp. And then with paper, it's usually quite easy just to smooth them slightly. Here, also be careful with paper and a bone folder. I'd rather use my fingers. So you basically just press it down well. And there we have our one cover. This is slightly uneven. Okay, that's the one cover. And I will put it under a plank, between planks and under a brick, and it should be ready in a couple of hours. Okay, for the previous video I did it fairly roughly with the eye, but that partly because I was also didn't have that much paper, but that did result in a slightly uneven edge here, which isn't a big deal because I can trim it before I case the book. But I'm now going to show you how a more accurate way, which might be a good idea when you're starting out. So in this cover, I've actually measured it out exactly where the boards will go, the 7mm gap, and then the spine board, another gap, and the other board. Also done, which I don't normally do, I normally just cut the corners with the naked eye. But I mentioned in my series on case binding that one can get or make little jigs for making the corner. And in fact, another bookbinder, Glen Malkin, if that's how you say his name, has just put a video out on making one of these. So I thought, well, let me try it. And I'll link to his video in the series below. It's a little thing like this. So normally people actually, I think, glue the board on first. I prefer putting the glue on the covering material rather than the board. So to do the spine then, I'm just going to line this up and cut my corners like that. And that basically means that I'll get very precise and even corner, hopefully. And then what I do is basically the same. For this book, I'm using a paste paper that I've made myself. I'm doing another video on how to make them. This is a super easy way of coloring paper, and also one of the easiest ways of doing paste paper. The only thing with paste paper is you need to be careful when you are using it that it doesn't stick to anything else, because it really is glue. So when it gets damp, it becomes quite sticky. So when we press it, we will need to put some non-stick paper behind it. But I'm basically now just doing what I did with the other one, smearing it in. Oh, except of course that with the other one I had already attached my boards to the craft paper, whereas with this one I'm going to place them directly onto this paper. But in order to show you how to do it very precisely, I've actually marked it off. When you become more experienced, you can put them straight onto your covering material simply with the naked eye. But for the time being, it might be worth being more precise. You can also use a roller for putting the glue on, or a bigger paintbrush, of course. I'm just a bit lazy because I don't want to wash one. So there we go. And I'm using a fairly thinnish glue I explain that more in the series on case binding. Right. You may find when you measure this off that it actually becomes, that your measurements aren't very precise, because when you glue the paper, it tends to expand. So you may actually end up having more space around the edges. And if it does do that, just make sure that the top and bottom are lined up straight. Right, and then it's basically the same as what we did with the other one. Just being careful that you don't get your paper glue where it's not supposed to. I mean, it's really only a bit later that you'll notice that, but yeah. Push in the corners ever so slightly. Be careful to go over all the edges. And be careful. And people, this is only paper, but once it has glue on it and the glue dries, it actually becomes quite strong. Or at least stronger than one might think, not as strong as board or at least as linen or leather. But no, it's actually. Anyway, and that, I don't know if you can see it so well because it blends a bit into the green of the board, but that's my, it's actually quite an effective cover, I think. So like the other one, I'll put it up between boards and under a brick for a couple of hours, but with this, well, at this point it's probably not too serious, but I would probably put a piece of wax paper over it before I do that. Because I'm not going to demonstrate how I did it. You can look at the video in the case binding series for that. But what I've done here is also attached headbands, head or tail bands, and these are just simple fabric headbands that I made. But you can see the process in that video, which I'll link to. However, it should be noted that headbands are optional and they're really just a decorative thing. Okay, we now come to what we call casing in the book block, where we attach the book block to the cover. I start by just rounding the spine slightly. I'm just using this hammer, but you could use a broomstick or anything. Just round that slightly. It can also be a good idea to press the boards in slightly. And then check that it fits well. if your measurements are good, then you should have hopefully equal an equal distance on each side, at the top and the bottom and the sides, but you may have to wriggle it a bit to get that. Okay, so what we do then is take a piece of scrap paper and I'm using a fairly thick glue, and I basically glue not on the spine but from the spine outwards. You don't want to use more glue than necessary, but it does need to be fairly well covered. Always have a damp cloth around because you will get glue on your fingers. And then I basically position this down from where I saw it was going to go. Hopefully with an equal space around each. And I press it down, and then I do the same on the other side. Always working outwards so that you don't get glue under the paper if you did that. And then this is where it's slightly tricky. You need to bring it up, not get your finger dirty, and then pull it in. And this is where you can manipulate it a little bit to try and, if it's not quite straight, pull it straight. This one is reasonable, so I think that will be okay. Now what I do is I put it between two boards. I've actually found it useful to use pieces of masonite between my boards because my boards inevitably get messed up. Place it so that the board of the cover is entirely covered by this board. And then I would normally put that in the press and press it hard, but because I'm working on the assumption that you may not have a press, I'm going to do the same as I did in the video on in the series on case binding, and rather use these G-clamps. Although in this case it's a somewhat bigger book, so I will use 4. Okay, my G-clamps were actually a bit small, so I had to do it the other way around. But whatever form of press you have, if you have a press, that's great. You can also get these presses that consist of 2 boards and some metal threads. But basically you need to press it briefly now. What I then do is open it up. Okay, when I've pressed it briefly, I open it up and just make sure that you can sometimes, especially if you have too much glue, it will come out here. But this seems fine. And what I do now, although this is optional, is that I'm going to, on these, I explain this in more depth in the video in the case binding series, but on my masonite boards I have glued some skewers that help to give me a groove. So I'm now going to put them back so that the groove is in the or that the skewers are in the gap here, and they will press it down. They will press it, let me see, press it down so that when it's pressed you will get a groove like that. So I'm now going to put it in the press. It can be a good idea after pressing it for a little while to just check that you don't have glue coming out here, which sometimes does happen, but it seems okay. If there's a bit of glue. If there is glue that has come out, just wipe it off. So I'll basically put this back in the press and leave it overnight to press, and then in the morning we will attach some labels and then it will be finished. Now for the other book I'm actually going to show you a slightly different method which uses what is called an Oxford hollow that attaches which is attached both to the spine of the book and to the spine of the cover, and it really just gives extra strength. I wouldn't advise using this all the time, but for books that are frequently used or for very heavy books it can be a good idea. And it can also help if you're starting out, because it gives you a bit more wriggle room when you are trying to attach the cover to the book block. So to do this, I've already cut it. Basically, there are different ways of doing this, but this is how I was taught. You basically measure the, which one? No, this one. Measure the width of the spine, measure that, and then fold it in 3. So you have what's going to be a folded tube that is the width of the spine. And we then glue the tube closed. This really, just any sort of good quality craft paper can be used for this. This is possibly not very good quality, but it will do for this demonstration. And then so glue that and press it well, and then make sure that it can still open, that it doesn't get glued up at the top and bottom. And then what we're going to do, so that was the width of the spine, and it's just slightly shorter than the length of the book, because we want it to go just under where the book comes. And so what we then do is then using fairly thick glue, I don't know if I said, but I've been using PVA for everything with this. I say more about materials in the series on case binding. That's what comes of having one's own headbands. So just this book doesn't really need an Oxford hollow, but I'm doing it in order to demonstrate it to you as a possible. And then when you're going to attach it, you attach the side, the single side, so that the double side is on the outside. Place it in place, and then rub it very well. important to rub this well, because there's nothing that's going to be pressing it down. And then you leave that to dry, and then we'll proceed with the next step. Once the Oxford Hollow is dry, what we do, and you can actually round your spine again slightly, although it would probably round itself from what we're going to do next. What we do is then put glue on both the inside of the spine and on the Oxford Hollow, so not quite to the top, but roughly to where it's going to come. And again, we use fairly thick glue for this. Another brush would be easier, but okay. And then we do the same thing on here. Not going quite to the top. Okay, and then we are going to put it in place. So we do the same as what we did with the other one. In fact, I should have checked it before. For some reason, I think I've got the measurements wrong and my boards are longer, but at least they're even everywhere. And the nice thing with this method, yes, my boards are definitely longer than 4 millimeters longer. I don't know what I did. Otherwise they would be okay. Anyway, you basically push it into place so that you get it even and lined up nicely, and then rub the spine well. And I'm now basically going to put it, being very careful that it stays lined up properly. Put it between two boards and just put a weight on it. The weight really is just to keep it in place, not anything else. And rub the spine a bit more and leave it to dry. Once the spine is glued, we basically do what we did with the other cover in terms of gluing down the end pages. The difference being that its position is now set. And for some reason I did make the boards too long. I mean, the measurements on the side are fine, but this is a really stupid mistake, because it's usually this that's the tricky bit. Anyway, so I'm now going to basically do the same thing. I can tend to overdo this. You can put a bit of glue in here, but if you do too much, it will come out when you press it. So basically just make sure that you get it evenly covered, but without too much glue. I don't know where my cloth is. And then there's not really any room left for rigging it round. Basically push it down and do the same on the back. Once I've glued both boards down, I do the same as what I did with the other one and put it in the press between boards. The only thing is, because I'm using paste paper here, I'm going to put wax paper between the book and the board just to be safe. And then I do the same, and I'll press this briefly, and then when I've checked it, or when I've pressed it, I just take it out and check that there's no excess glue. It doesn't seem to be. And then I'll do what I did with the other one as well, and use these skewer stick thingies on the side to create a groove. So I can be a bit tricky with the wax paper. But I'll basically that in there. There we go. And then I'll put that in the press again, press it, check it again, and leave it in the press overnight. And tomorrow we'll attach the label. It's now the next morning, and the final step is that I'm going to glue a label to the spine of the book. This is really optional, and it's something that would normally be done with gold foiling, or at least often be done with gold foiling, but that's not an accessible method for many people. And so for a simple binding like this, a label can do just as well. So I've printed this label out, being sure that the grain runs in the length like that, which is quite important for this. And I am then really just going to glue the back of it using fairly thick PVA. There are also other options for this, but I'm just doing something simple. And then being careful not to get the glue on it, I place it on the spine. I've cut the label out to be precise, hopefully at least to be precisely the width of the spine. And then you'll need a dry cloth that you can use to rub it in with, and also rub off any excess glue. And it's important here just to really work it in well. You can also use the bone folder. It's possible to also do this before you case the book, but I prefer doing it afterwards because one then works it around the rounded surface. So there we are, and there we have it. I've done the other one as well. So our books are now complete. So here we have our two books with our different covers that are rebound. If you found this video helpful, then please like and share it. And please also let me know if you have any questions or topics you would like to have discussed.